Good afternoon, students. Today we are going to be studying SOC211, Introduction to Population Studies. Today we are just going to take the introductory part of the course, and I'm happy to be here to take the course as a course lecturer. My name is Dr. Magdalene Igbolo. Today we are going to look at population studies, like I said, and at the end of the lecture, I expect that students should be able to understand what the study of population is all about, the concept of population, the relevance of the study of population, the relationship between population studies and other disciplines within the social science study, and then the major sources of population data collection. So we begin by introducing the course. Now, in the course of human existence, the study of population has been carried on from time to time. I mean, it's been a major part of human existence, basically because there's no way we can do anything in the society without understanding the population that we are dealing with. That is to say that the interest in the study of human population started from a long time ago. In fact, it started from the creation of man. If you go to biblical times, you'll see that even before Jesus was born, there was a series of censuses that took place. Even when he was born, a census was ordered. And so, study of human population has been in existence as long as before Christ. And so we see that the understanding of human population, or the study of human population, has helped society to be what it is in terms of understanding what to do, how to plan society, how to integrate population elements into the development or into the planning of development of any particular society. Now, what is population studies, which is exactly why we are here? Population studies has to do with the scientific study of human populations. Now, I say scientific study of human population. You might want to ask, why is it a scientific study of human population? Because we apply the techniques of science. It's a social science discipline, and because it is better in sociology departments, it makes use of the methods of science in understanding human populations. That if you go back to basic sociology, you'll see that it has to do with the study of human behavior. That is to say that behavior of human beings in any particular society affects the outcome of that activities of people in that particular society. So it is important to understand what influences the behavior of those people in that particular society, in this case, as it relates to population elements or population factors. Now, when we are talking about population elements, we are talking about the basic components of population change, which has to do with the fertility of the people, the mortality of the people, and the migration pattern that society engages in from time to time. So you say that there's no way you can talk about population or talking about any particular society without these three major components, because every society must reproduce itself. In that same society, people must die. In that same society, people must migrate. People must move from one place to the other. And so they are the major components of population change. That is to say that whatever happens to any of these components is likely to affect that society, the population of that society, in terms of either increase or decrease in that population. For example, if there's an increase in fertility of a particular society, there's bound to be an increase in the rate of growth of the population of that society. The same thing is applied to increase in mortality. If there's an increase in mortality, there's likely going to be a decrease in the population of that particular society. So also with migration, that is to say that if there is an increase in migration of people out of a particular population, it will either affect that population in terms of the number of people that are leaving that population and then adding up to another population in another society. So basically, that's what this whole study, a population study, is all about. The cost population study is all about. And so we are going to be looking at that subsequently in greater detail. That is, we'll look at each of the components in greater details, including the factors that affect them as the case may be, and particularly as it relates to our own society, which is Nigeria. Now, I had said that population studies has to do with the scientific study of human population. The question that will follow, or that will bog the mind of anybody that is listening to that, will be, why should we study human populations? That leads me to discussing the relevance of human population. Now, the number one reason why we have to study population is to understand the culture of that particular society. Now, for every society, culture plays a major role. The culture of a society determines the outcome of their behavior. For example, we take the issue of sex preference, for instance. We discover that it's a major cultural attitude of particular people in some particular societies, especially in our own part of the world. In our country, Nigeria, for example, among the Igbos, it is a crime for a woman not to give birth to a male child. And so we see that in any marriage where there's no male child, among the Igbos, that marriage is largely unstable. And so that culture has come to stay, and therefore it influences the fertility behavior of the people of that particular region, especially the people of Africa and Nigeria in particular. So understanding the culture of the people will actually give us a hint to the way the influences, around their fertility behavior. What do they do? What affects the decisions they take in terms of the number of children they decide to have at the end of the day? Because again, the number of children that any particular couple decides to have is also influenced by the culture of a particular society. We see that in Africa and in most third world countries where they are largely agrarian, their fertility behavior is tends towards the nature of their environment, basically because they need these large families for their farming activities and cultivation. And so you see that most of the families have large number of children, particularly because they have to depend on these children for the sources of labor to work in their farms, as well as economic sources. Now you see that people use their children to hawk, to sell things, to do all kinds of things in different communities, because they see them as a source of economic support for their various societies. Again, we need to understand human populations because it enables government and policymakers to plan accurately, to plan in accordance with the number of people or the size of the population that exists in the society. Now, there is no population, there's no society, or there's no government that can plan adequately without understanding the total number of people that exist in that particular society. So you see that it is important for government to take into consideration population elements. Now, when I say population elements, I'm not just talking about the size, I'm talking about the distribution of that population, the composition of that population, as well as the size of that population. Now, when you talk about the distribution, we are talking about how the population is distributed in terms of size and in terms of space and time. Now, how many people are living in the rural areas and how many people are living in the urban areas? It is important because it will enable government to know where to provide the facilities and amenities that are needed, as well as infrastructures for the use of that particular population. That is to say that where you have a larger proportion of the population, it is important for government to understand that that particular society requires a large, a high number or huge presence of infrastructures in that particular society. again, the composition of the population will also help government to plan effectively. Now, if a government does not understand how many people, that is in terms of males or females, that make up the population, or the number of children that are in that particular population, it will not allow them to plan effectively. So knowing the number of women, for instance, will enable government know that where you have a large population of women in a particular society, you know that the tendency is for that population to keep growing, because more and more women will likely get into marriage and they will give birth to more children. And so there will be need for increase in the number of hospitals and maternities. There will be need for increase in the number of schools that the children they are giving birth to will require to attend. So also with the element of size. The size of population will enable government to know the number of people to plan for. I mean, even in our families, we know that when you know the number of people you are cooking for or you're planning for in a day, it allows you to plan adequately or to make enough provisions for the people that are present in your household at a particular point in time. Now, we look at the relationship between population studies and other disciplines within the social science and other faculties or other disciplines. Now we take, for instance, the discipline of sociology, which sociology is bettered. Now we see that in sociology, for instance, we study human behavior. We look at what influences human behavior, because we know that human behavior is dynamic, that is subject to influences around the environment and around the society. So you cannot understand human behavior or the population of a particular people without understanding what influences it. And that is why in sociology, the study of human population is very important in order to understand exactly what influences that the behavior of people in that particular society. Like I said earlier, culture is one of them, religion is one of them, and all of that. And the example I gave of the people from the Igbo extraction, the same example goes for people in northern Nigeria. For instance, you see that the Islamic religion, for instance, allows a man to marry as many as 4 wives. And most times, like I used to say, a man who has to marry as many as 4 wives, for instance, the possibility is that if each of the wives is going to have at least 4 children each, that means in the first instance, that man can have as many as 16 children. And subsequently, if he divorces that one and decides to marry another one, it goes on and on and on and continues to add to the population of the society. And so it is important that sociologists understand what influences such behaviors in the society. And that's why the relationship between sociology and population studies. The same thing with economics. Now, like I said, no government can plan adequately without understanding or taking into consideration the elements of population. So, this influences exactly what goes on in planning. Now, we know that economics has to do with demand and supply, and the number of people in any particular society influences what the government plans for, what companies will plan for in terms of the demand and supply that will take place in that particular society. If you have a larger population, it means there's going to be increase in demand. And therefore, any company who is into any serious business will know that they are supposed to increase their supply to meet the needs of the growing population. The same thing with geography, which has to do with the study of human distribution in the society and all of that, and the environment. We know that increase in any particular population in the society is supposed to be matched with increase in supply, basically because the demand of that population will increase, and the society and the company or government will have to increase their supply to meet with the demands of that particular population. Now, that takes me to also looking at the relationship between population studies and the biological sciences or the medical sciences. Now, to cast your mind back to the introduction I gave, I mentioned the three major components of change. Fertility is one of them. Mortality is another. Now, two of these components basically have to do with human life. One has to do with reproduction, and the other one has to do with the rate of mortality in the society. Now, we cannot study population without understanding what influences people to reproduce. And like I mentioned earlier, the culture of that people is a major factor. The reproductive pattern of that particular society is always influenced by the culture of that particular society, as well as the environment for which they find themselves. And therefore, you cannot separate this from what the population of the society from the activities of reproduction and the activities of death, because whether we like it or not, in our demographic progress, two things at least must happen to us. You must be born and you must die. Whether you migrate or not, two of these three components must happen to you. That takes me to looking at the sources of population data collection. So long as we have human beings in the society, there must be need for us to understand what those human beings are doing in that particular society. And so for us to do most of these things or understand what goes on in these human societies, we have to collect data relating to the activities of human beings in this particular society. And so we have different methods of collecting population data. We have 5 major sources of collecting data. Number 1 is a population census. Number 2 is a vital registration system or vital statistics. Number 3 is sample surveys. Number 4 is population registers. And the last one is the non-traditional methods. Now, we are going to look at each of them briefly to give you understanding of what we are actually talking about. The first one I mentioned is population census. Now, this is what we are all very familiar with because at least in Nigeria we have had, the much I can remember, since I became an adult, we have had 2 major censuses. That is, since I became an adult. But censuses have been in existence right from the creation of man. And like I said from the introduction I gave, even before Christ. That is to say that it's always been there, And in Nigeria, censuses started in the year 1866 in Lagos. And then it has progressed from 1866 up till the last one we had in 2006. Now, what is census? Census has to do with the head count of human beings within a particular geographical territory. The head count of human beings within a particular geographical territory. Now, pay attention to what I said. It has to do with the head count of people. It has to be within a defined territory. That is to say that you don't carry out a census at random. There has to be a defined territory where the people living within that particular geographical territory will be counted at any particular point in time that a government chooses to carry out a census. Now, there are certain features that must accompany a census. Apart from the fact that it has to do with the head count of people, it is carried out periodically, mostly every 10 years. Every 10 years in the sense that the 10 years is a universal figure that has been set by most countries because it gives countries enough room to plan for the next one. That is to say that because it is not a cheap exercise, it's an exercise that is capital intensive. It requires a lot of resources and manpower to be able to execute a good enough census. So it takes that long to be able to plan for a good and accurate census. So it must be done every 10 years. It must be done within a defined territory. It is not just done by anybody. Can only be carried out by a government at any particular in time. That is basically because it is capital intensive and requires a lot of resources. Now, what are the major uses of census? The number one use of census is that it is used for planning. Planning of the nation, planning of the economy, planning of anything that has to do with the development of that society requires a census, or the data that will be collected through a census. Because in collecting a census, you'll be able to understand the total number of people that live in that particular country, that particular community, that particular society at that particular point in time. It will also enable you know the total number, the composition of the population. Now, when we talk about the composition, we are talking about the number of males and females that exist in that particular population, as well as the number of children, because they are important. Now, they are important in the sense that you cannot do any planning without taking into consideration the number of children in that particular society or country, because whatever you're going to provide in terms of hospitals, in terms of schools, in terms of other social amenities must take into consideration the young population that is coming up, because you have to plan effectively for them. Now, again, the planning of the society does not just end with providing social amenities. It also takes into consideration the economy of that society, how well the government can provide for the population that it has in existence at that particular point in time. That is to say that a government is supposed to ensure that its population is adequately catered for in terms of the provision of food, the provision of water, the provision of education, the provision of hospitals, and so on and so forth. So the number one use of census figure or census data is for planning. The second use is for revenue allocation. That is actually is something that is peculiar to our own country now, because most countries don't use population figures for revenue allocation. But for us in Nigeria, census figures are important for revenue allocation, basically because we build our revenue allocation around the size of the population. And so the states with the largest number of population tends to get the highest revenue allocation in Nigeria. Then the third use of population census is for state creation. Now, the determinant, the requirements for creation of states in Nigeria, for example, is built around the number of people you have in that particular society. And so when you have data that tells you that a state, for instance, like Lagos State, that has about between 15 and 16 million people, even though the Lagos State itself is claiming that there are about 19 million people. But if you go by the last census, I think there are about 15 million people in Lagos State. And then if another state is going to be created from Lagos State, it means it's qualified to have another state, because even 3 more states, because some states actually have just about 2 million people. A state like Bayelsa, even FCT has less than 2 million people by the last census result. And so you see that in Nigeria, for instance, population figures are essential for state creation, as well as local government creation, as well as the creation of electoral wards, down to even the creation of enumeration wards. So we see that population figures are important, which are collected through censuses, are important for all of these issues that I have mentioned. It is also used for allocation of resources to different places, as the case may be. In our own case, we have 36 states, so when resources are going to be allocated, it is important that population factors or population figures are taken into consideration. Censuses also have different problems. In Nigeria, for instance, we have had cases of irregular censuses or inaccurate censuses, or censuses that we have not been able to rely wholly and entirely on the figures that have been churned out. Now, the number one problem of why we don't really rely on our census figures are not reliable is the fact that they are politicized. politicization of census figures have really made our census figures not to be reliable. Politicians do everything to ensure that their states have large large population figures. I mean, the crisis between Lagos and Kano, the contest between Lagos and Kano, claiming which state has the highest number of people and which state is uncalled for, assuming that we didn't have to depend on census figures for revenue allocation. There wouldn't have been any need for any state to be claiming that is the highest or is the largest in terms of population figure. But because we have had to rely on population figure for revenue allocation, people now have to claim that they have so population figure even when it does not exist. And because again it is tied to state creation, it is tied to the creation of local governments, we now have to politicize most of these things just to ensure, politicians have to ensure that they create figures for themselves and all of that, inflate figures during censuses to be able to have a high number of or a large population in order to lay claims to some of these things that are supposed to be beneficial to their states. In the second point is inflation of figures, following closely, because it is politicized, there's inflation of census figures. Number 3 is the problem of poor funding and inadequate planning. Now, we were supposed to have a census in 2016. If you count 10 years from 2006, 2016 would have been 10 years exactly, and there was supposed to be another census. But this is 2018. We still don't know when the next census is going to take place. This has to do with the problem of poor planning. If we plan adequately, it is possible for us to have a census within 10 years. But because we don't plan effectively and adequately for the next one, we always have issues. And like I said, because censuses are capital intensive, it's not something that anybody can just do. Government needs a lot of resources to do. So the planning for the next census is supposed to begin the day the last one ended. So they begin to plan, look for the money, get whatever funding they are going to get, train people to be able to participate in this census, especially the ad hoc staff that they use during the census, the enumerators that they use during the census exercise. The last one exposed us to a lot of problems. We saw that the enumerators were not inadequately trained because they were just trained under 1 week. And anything that has to do with, that is technical, that has to do with statistics, you need a lot of training for people to understand what they are supposed to be doing in the field. And that's why we found that a lot of results were rejected. Some forms were rejected. The machines couldn't accept most of the machines because of poor filling and all of that. And so we see the problem of inadequate planning, that of poor funding. At the end of the day, the last census, I think, was funded by some international organization because Nigeria as a country could not fund that exercise. And then we have the problem of logistics, the provision of vehicles and all of that will take people, and materials that will take people to their various places of enumeration. Then we also have the problem of poor training of the manpower that is supposed to be used for the exercise. And then we have the problem of terrain and culture. It's always an interesting point for me when I have to teach students about the problems of that surround census, especially that of terrain. Now, you don't send somebody to a terrain that person is not familiar with. You send somebody who is from, let's say, Sokoto, that has never seen a river in his life. And then you send that person to Bayelsa to go and enumerate people in Bayelsa, where he has to enter a speedboat and all that. The sight of an ocean is enough to scare the person. And the person can actually stand by the bank of the ocean and sell the forms to anybody to go and do it for him. And in the process of doing that, whatever happens, any irregularities that will take place, the person has no control over because you were not part of the exercise. And so it is important that people are sent to terrains that they are familiar with. If somebody is from Sokoto, send the person to... The person may not work in Sokoto, but he can work within the environment that he will be familiar with and he can cope effectively. And again, that of culture. Now, when I say culture, I'm not just talking about culture as culture. I'm talking about culture in its entirety, which includes religion and the economy of the people. Now, if you go to a place like the far north in Nigeria, you see that the Islamic culture is embedded into the culture of that society. And so you cannot send somebody who is a Christian, for example, to go and enumerate somebody who is a Muslim in the far north, where in every society, in every of their households, they have the tag, no entry, Bashiga. That means we don't allow people who are not part of us to enter into this compound. So whatever the head of that household comes to tell you is what you are going to enumerate. What do I mean by that? I want to lay emphasis on that, because when people go out to enumerate, you see that they get to these communities, they are not allowed entry into a particular household. And so the head of the household comes out to tell you, I have 20 people inside this compound. This curtain that is covering here has 20 people inside there. I have 5 women and 20 children. Whatever that man tells you is what you are going to record, which makes it, which in itself creates a problem for that exercise, because you didn't see the people, and you're supposed to see the people and count them physically as you see them. So if you don't see them, it means whatever counting you did there is faulty. Now that's what happens. Now you're not supposed to send somebody who cannot have access to that particular society. You can only send somebody who that society will accept to be able to do the counting effectively. These are considered the major problems that affect the reliability or the inaccurate results that we actually bring out at the end of any census exercise. We have 2 main types of censuses. The first one is the de facto type of census, and the second one is the jury type of census. The de facto type of census is the census that has to do with people being counted where they are found as at the day of census. That is to say that wherever you are found on the day of census, that is where you will be counted. If you live in Abuja and you decide to travel to your state during census, you'll be counted for your state. Let's say you are from Kaduna, and you leave Abuja to travel to Kaduna on the day or the eve of census or the day of census, you'll be counted for Kaduna, not for Abuja. And that's a problem, because where you live is where you're supposed to be counted. You're adding to the pressure of the infrastructures that exist in that particular place where you spend 90% of your life. Now, you only go to Kaduna maybe for a visit or for holiday of 1 or 2 weeks, but you return back to Abuja and live 90% of your life in Abuja, and you were not counted for Abuja. So you have reduced from the population of Abuja, or the population of people that are putting pressure on the infrastructures in Abuja, to add to the population of people in Kaduna. And that again takes us back to the problem of politicization. If you remember what happened in the last census in 2006, politicians and governors in particular sent out vehicles to different parts of Nigeria to pick their citizens, their indigenes, to go back to their states and be counted for their states. There's a problem with that, because like I said, you are supposed to be counted where you reside, where you usually reside. And because of the type of census we practice in Nigeria, which is the first type, the de facto type of census, people are counted where they are found on the day of census. If you decide to leave Abuja and go to your state, you'll be counted for your state, just so as to add to the population of your state, instead of the population of Abuja where you usually reside. The second one is the jury type of census. The jury type of census is the type that you are counted where you usually reside. That is to say that whether you are around on the day of census or not, you are going to be counted for that place where you reside. For example, those of us who live and work in Abuja, if census is going to be taking place today, all they need to do is come to your house where you usually reside and drop the forms for you. So you just pick the forms, fill the forms, and return it back to the commission, and they will take they will collect the data as provided in the form. But that cannot work in Nigeria, because there's going to be a lot of falsehood, and that's why we are using the other technique, which is the de facto type. We go to the second one, which is vital statistics or vital registration system. The vital registration system, just like the population census, is a major source of data collection all over the world. in some parts of the world, it is working very effectively, and therefore they may not require a census as often as it is supposed to be done if the vital registration system is working effectively. Now, what is vital registration system? It has to do with the collection, the continuous, the permanent collection of vital statistics. Now, when we say vital statistics, we are talking about statistics that relate to the births, deaths, migration, marriages, divorces. All those statistics that are unique to each individual are those statistics we consider as vital. And so the continuous and permanent recording of these statistics is what we call the vital registration system. Now, this system, like I said, in some countries, in more advanced countries, is working very effectively. That is to say that whenever a child is born, the birth of that child is recorded, and peradventure that child dies, the death of that child is also recorded. Whenever any person gets married, that marriage is recorded. Whenever somebody has to migrate from any place, that the migration of that person is also recorded. Whenever there's a divorce and all that, all those statistics are are recorded. And so it helps the government to know what is going on as it relates to the people that live within their territory. Now, this system doesn't seem to work very well in Nigeria, even though we have some agencies that are saddled with the responsibility of recording vital statistics, like the National Population Commission, the National Civic Registration Commission. They are all the agencies that are saddled with the responsibility of taking record of vital statistics. But as it is, they are not really working the way they should, kind of things. So that system doesn't seem to work as it should work in Nigeria, for example, but in other countries, it is working effectively. Now, like the census, again, it is used for planning, basically for planning. The third one is the sample survey. Now, like the name goes, it has to do with the selection of a sample for the collection of that data. Now, when we say the selection of a sample, it means it does not cover the entire country or the entire territory. It takes a sample of a population and then collects information from that sample and then uses it to generalize for the entire country. What we have in Nigeria is a National Demographic and Health Survey. That is the the type of sample survey that we do in Nigeria, the NDHS, National Demographic and Health Survey. That's what we have in Nigeria. Other countries have their different types. And in carrying out an NDHS, what government does is take a sample of the entire population of Nigeria. Sometimes they decide to take samples from the 6 geopolitical zones. They could choose to take one state each from the 6 geopolitical zone, or 2 states each. At the end of the day, they collect data from those states and then use the results of that survey to generalize for the entire population. They collect data beyond just the demographic factors and include health factors like HIV/AIDS, incidence of malaria, cholera, and all of that, housing condition, and so on and so forth. And so it kind of gives a larger detail of the kind of data that it's required, even though it does not cover the entire population. Again, it is used for planning. Then the fourth one is the population registers. They are similar. Population registers are similar to the vital registration system because it also has to do with the recording of events as they occur. Now, most countries are not really using the population register. Some countries do, some don't. Like Ghana. Ghana uses the population registers, and it's working effectively in Ghana and some other countries. So it's just used to record events as they occur, and that's why they are called population registers. When these events occur, they are recorded in those registers, which can be referred to at any point in time when the need arises. Then we have the last one, which is the non-traditional methods. Now, they are called non-traditional, not because they have anything to do with tradition, but because they are not conventional. in the sense that they are not applicable in all societies of the world. That's why we call them the non-traditional. In some literature, you find non-conventional methods. Now, what are those non-traditional methods? They have to do with some things that we do. For instance, we use to collect data that are unusual. For instance, you want to do a research on school enrollment. I mean, the rate at which children are entering school. For instance, the girl child, to see if there's any improvement in the rate at which the girl child is entering school. You can actually get that from different schools in Nigeria by just going to the school and using their enrollment register. It will give you information on how many children, how many girls were admitted into that particular school within a particular year. And so it's not a normal technique, you know. Again, you can also get what they call the age grade system. Now, it's a very funny system, a very funny technique, but it is very useful because in societies where they practice the age grade system, they must have a record of births in that particular society. That's the only way you can know the number of people that are born in a particular community or a particular village. Like where I come from, we practice the age grade system. So you see that in my community, there's always one person that is appointed to take charge of that register. So any person that is born on any particular day is recorded and month is recorded. So when the coming of age ceremony comes, all you need to do is go to the man and ask for that register, and it will give you a list of all the people that were born in that particular year. The same thing with the people that die. They keep record of people that die in that particular year. So you can get record of people that are born and record of people that die in that particular year. The only record they may not have is that of migration because, I mean, it's not their business. But what is their business? The record of birth and the record of death. They keep it because of the practice of the age grade system. So also with church records, like the Catholic Church keeps a record of baptism, of people that are baptized in the church every year, the number of people who dedicate children every year. They have such records, and so more other churches. Those records can actually help you to collect information for whatever research you want to do or whatever planning you want to do in a particular community. I want to believe that we have covered a lot in this lecture, and by the next time we are going to meet, we are going to be looking at theories of population studies. And I will want each and every one of you to read ahead of time. That is to say that go online, check out for the various theories that I've tried to explain population factors, so that by the time we are meeting in the next class, you would have been familiar with what we are going to be talking about. Thank you.